Next, delivering the thesis, Don't Forget the Way to Fairyland, Why Christians Should Read Fairy Stories for Discipleship. Please welcome Emma Wang.
You should believe in fairy tales. Fairy tales? Those bedtime stories our parents told us about wicked stepmothers, fairies, happily ever afters to teach us pithy morals? Those are just fiction, right? But what if I told you that there are some people, many of whom are widely read and respected in the academic world, who believe in fairy tales, literally? And many of those fairy tale believers are believers. They claim that just as fairy tales can instruct children, so fairy tales can instruct Christians because they are more integral and true to the Christian life than ever imagined. Christian instruction, or in this case, Christian discipleship, is the lifelong process of growing, thinking, feeling, and living as a Christian. Something so integral to the faith should be fostered, but other than the Bible and the church, what other resources are that important for Christian discipleship? Through the Bible, Christians are being discipled by a story. The Bible is not just limited to theological teachings, but includes parables and psalms, which instructed those in the Bible as they do Christians today. The stories of the Bible disciple Christians. Should secular stories also? Christians have debated their relationship to secular sources since the early years of the church. Around the 2nd century, Tertullian of Carthage taught that Christians don't need Greek philosophy because they don't require anything beyond the teachings of Christ to explain or support them. Conversely, Clement of Alexandria believed that Greek philosophy is beneficial if connected to Christian theology because it does contain truth which comes from divine providence. What then should Christians read? Some Christian authors, including G.K. Chesterton, J.R.R. Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis, advocated for what they called fairy stories, a broad term including mythology, folklore, and fairy tales. A fairy story is one where ordinary, unsuspecting characters engage in a struggle between good and evil, climaxing in a revelation, transformation, and a miraculous turn of events, the eucatastrophe. They immerse readers in a fantasy world to seek satisfaction, delight, enrichment, growth, and truth. Although some may deem fairy stories to be unwholesome, I argue that they should be a part of Christian discipleship because ultimately, the gospel is the true fairy story. As the climax of a fairy story, the eucatastrophe is a suitable starting point for this claim. A term first defined by J.R.R. Tolkien, the eucatastrophe is a sudden joyous turn, a sudden miraculous grace. Proper to the fairy story genre, it delivers the consolation of a happy ending, giving readers a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. A servant trips while carrying Snow White's coffin, dislodging the apple stuck in her throat. The prince manages to find Rapunzel while wandering blind. When things are bleakest, a force outside the characters' power rescues them. A fairy story whispers to characters and to readers the possibility of miraculous rescue, powerful, wonderful, and wild. Tolkien even calls it Evangelion, gospel-like. And this is the great idea. The gospel is a fairy story. It's unsuspecting, ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, women are rescued, revealed as a repentant and transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. It is the climax in the struggle between good and evil, where joy and grace break in on the world in the form of two eucatastrophes. God entering the world as a human to rescue us from our helplessness, and Jesus' resurrection, which sealed that rescue. However, unlike all fairy stories, this one actually happened. The gospel is fairy story and fact, and it's not any less a fairy story by being fact. Furthermore, according to C.S. Lewis, it is not just a story to be read or a fact to be learned, it is a drama to be enacted. We are part of the cast of ordinary, unsuspecting characters who did nothing to merit our salvation and transformation, bought with the eucatastrophe of the gospel. We believe and live in this fairy story. Thus, our Christian discipleship is about believing and living in this fairy story. So, why should Christians read fairy stories if the gospel is one itself? Because Christians can learn once again how to see the gospel and their lives that way. Whenever we read Snow White, we're reminded of what it was like to wake from death. Whenever we read Rapunzel, we're reminded of what it was like to be found while wandering blind. Fairy stories teach us again of the fairy story that we live in. However, some Christians might oppose fairy stories for their pagan roots and often very real demonic activity. In The City of God, St. Augustine narrates how evil spirits disguised as the Roman pantheon manipulated a man to maintain the immoral mythology that was dedicated to them. He concludes that the power of these gods proves they exist. Myths are encouraged by evil spirits for their worship. Should we read them? In reply, it's important to consider how the events of the gospel changes our response to pagan stories. When resolving a dispute on eating food offered to idols, Paul concludes that Christians can eat such food, and that ultimately, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Applying this idea to fairy stories, Tolkien writes that with the gospel as the true fairy story, art has been verified. God is Lord of angels and of men and of elves. The fairy story of the gospel revealed God as Lord of that genre, meaning all fairy stories find their purpose in serving him by pointing to the gospel. And with that in mind, Christians can read fairy stories to the glory of God. More than that, Christians should take discipleship from fairy stories because they live in the one that matters. Just as Clement believed that Greek philosophy can benefit Christians, so can these stories, because God is Lord of fairy stories, not only because he is of everything, but also because he has written his gospel in this genre. This is not just some interesting perspective, but a reality. The wonder of God's story, the broken curse, and joy breaking in beyond the walls of the world. Fairy stories remind us of that wonder, that broken curse, that joy. We believe in this fairy story. So, read fairy stories for the glory of God, because they will help us live, because the gospel is the true fairy story in which we live. Thank you.